Well, thank you very much, Ray. He's very generous. I certainly did not win all of our debates. He's a formidable debater, and a very kind introduction. Thank you very much. I also want to commend the Iranian American community of Northern California for organizing this important forum this morning. I had a chance to speak with a number of you this morning, and certainly it's a delight to be here. America has vital interest in Iran, and all of your activities here demonstrate how much the American people care about Iran. It's one of the biggest foreign policy challenges that we face, and this morning you'll hear a range of views of how we ought to approach it. But every single one of them is going to underscore the need for democratic change and respect for human rights in Iran, which is a goal that I know all of you share. And if you watch the sweeping changes across the Arab world, when a fruit vendor's self-immolation in Tunisia sets off a wave of protest, anything can happen overnight. The people of Libya are still suffering under Muammar Gaddafi. The regimes of Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen continue to resist the march of history. And Iran remains locked in a time warp as well. And the failures of the regime in Tehran to live by the rules of the international community, its continued repression of democracy and the human rights of its people, stand as a real challenge, not just to those of you in this room, but to U.S. policies as well. Decades of our policies, sometimes isolations, other times outstretched hands, have simply failed to bring about fundamental change in this aging regime. The dramatic protests surrounding the elections in 2009 gave the world hope that fundamental changes were on the verge of occurring. Yet that Iranian spring or would-be green revolution was crushed by the brutal leadership that refuses to let the forces of democracy emerge. Now, the United States faces not only the challenge of democracy and human rights in Iran, but also three other key challenges, and often we handle these challenges with competing interest. First, Iran continues to support terrorist organizations that threaten our interest, including Hezbollah, Hamas, some of the Shia armed groups in Iraq. Second, it continues to seek a nuclear weapons capability which threaten America's close ally, Israel. And third, Iran continues to undermine our efforts both in Iraq and Afghanistan. And largely of this agenda, the nuclear policy drives U.S. policy and much of the international community. And it's the nuclear agenda that has driven many of the failed efforts at engagement across both Democratic and Republican U.S. administrations. Iran's controversial nuclear and international efforts to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons to Iran is what dominates the broad international discussion on Iran. The recent IAEA report highlights both the concerns about Iran's weaponization activities and its technical difficulties. And earlier this month, there was a report on a panel of UN experts that declared that the multilateral sanctions adopted under UN Security Council resolution last year, strongly supported by the Obama administration, is having a significant impact on Iran's ability to proceed with its nuclear program. In other words, pressure works on this regime. The new measures to prohibit Iran's procurement of items related to nuclear and ballistic materials activity is slowing the development of its nuclear activities. It's working and is changing the behavior of the regime. And what is perhaps most fascinating among the nuclear story is the Iranian nuclear facilities that were targeted by a highly specialized computer worm called the Stuxnet. And it apparently was designed to secretly infiltrate the centrifuge machines that refine the uranium and make them spin so fast they would break. Many people thought the spies who inserted this must have seen the Ocean's 11 dramatic end when they robbed the bank while the cameras are still rolling, but all the details aren't working out. But it does appear that that worm and the sanctions together have pushed back the Iranian nuclear timetable to at least 2015. but it also demonstrates how vigilant and creative the international community has to do in applying pressure. It's clear that Iran is decision-making is guided by a clear cost-benefit analysis, and the more pressure we put on Iran, the more you're going to get results. And while we're pushing the Iranian agenda, I think the U.S. needs to stay focused on what we're all here today to talk about, which is the increasing repression in the Iranian regime. As Secretary of State Hillary Clinton put it, Iran is moving towards a military dictatorship. And we need to all recognize that it is moving not towards a democratic system, as we saw in its response to the democratic protests on the streets in 2009, but the Revolutionary Guard is in effect supplanting the government of Iran, the supreme leader, the president, and the parliament. And Iran's repressive behavior, its nuclear program, its support for terrorism, undermining our interest in these regions are all directly related to the lack of democracy at home. They go hand in hand. And until that changes, until there is democratic change in Iran, the United States and our allies around the world will continue to face multiple threats from this regime. It will not change without a hand-in-hand democratic change. And a year and a half ago, before that young man set himself on fire in Tunisia, sparking that wave of protests, Iran's own protests surrounding the 2009 elections demonstrated the hopes and dreams of millions of Iranians and really captivated the world's attention. But as well as we all have seen, unlike in Tunisia and Egypt, the opposite happened in Iran, and the brutality is continuing against the protesters in Iran. And I had a chance to talk to many of you earlier this morning, and I don't need to tell you this. You have friends and families and relatives who have been subject to not only imprisonment but execution as well. The State Department's annual human rights report, which came out this April, reads like a textbook case of how a government can employ repression in literally every category followed by the United States. The government severely limits citizens' right to peacefully change their government through free and fair elections. It continues a campaign of post-election violence and intimidation. The government committed extrajudicial killings, executed persons, including juveniles, through unfair trials, sometimes group executions. Security forces under the government's control committed acts of politically motivated violence and repression, including torture, beatings, and rape. The government administered severe officially sanctioned punishments, including amputations and flogging. The list goes on. There are, at the end of last year, over 500 democracy activists and journalists in detention, in prison, and my guess is that number is on the low side. And some of you have experienced the brutality of this, not just during this 2009 election, but in years past. And this regime is still living in the 1970s. But the rest of the world is moving on into the 21st century, living up to standards of democracy and human rights. And while not anywhere near as strongly as we'd like, the international community is mounting increasing pressure on this regime. Earlier this year, the Human Rights Council at the UN, which just a short time ago was considered ineffective by some and an outlet for anti-Israeli rhetoric by others, did appoint an investigator for human rights violations in Iran. And that may not sound like a big step forward, but in the UN context, it's a monumental shift in their behavior. The UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said he was deeply troubled by reports of increased executions, amputations, arbitrary arrest and detention, unfair trials, possible torture and ill treatment of human rights activists, lawyers, journalists, and opposition activists. And this is a marked change in the international community's approach to trying to stand up to this regime that continues its repressive behavior. And the Arab Spring that's occurred throughout much of the Arab world has put a highlight the failure of the Iranian regime to change, and demonstrates yet again that it really is a relic of the past. Speaking at the U.S. Islamic World Forum, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton noted that Iran's leaders have consistently pursued policies of tyranny abroad and at home. And these actions have not been limited to those just inside Iran's borders as well. And we need to be vigilant of the Iranian activities outside of Iran as well. And particularly, I know many of you here are very concerned about the attacks on Camp Ashraf, particularly those last April. I think many of you have seen the brutal video footage of that assault. And it seems to have gone largely unnoticed by the United States, maybe because we were focused on the political brinkmanship here of a potential government shutdown. But we must never lose sight of the fact to stand up against these types of attacks. The responsibility of turning over the Camp Ashraf to the Iraqi government was conditional on Iraqi government assurances that the residents of the camp would remain protected. And the government of Iraq absolutely must stand by its obligation to protect those within that border, and the U.S. must push it harder to do so. And I know many of you here are deeply concerned about those in Camp Ashraf, but also very involved in the effort to push the U.S. government to delist the MEK from the State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism. And having worked closely in the Clinton administration with the peace process in Northern Ireland, I'm very familiar with the process of transformation that various groups that have engaged in the past in violence must undergo. And it is not an easy process, nor within the groups trying to avoid fissures and splinter groups, disagreements. All of these organizations have their own politics internally. And in the case of the MEK, you also face a government in Tehran that is providing zero democratic opening for change. And that poses a particular challenge when a group's trying to make a transformation. It was much easier with the Irish peace process when you had democratic governments both in Ireland and the UK willing to engage and give some political space. Within the U.S. government, old habits die very, very hard as well. But the process of change is an essential change. It is essential that this process occur, especially now in the 20th century. I am confident the Obama administration's current review will be decided on the merits. I know many of you think that it's all a political process in the past, but having spoken to a variety of people in the administration, I do think this will be decided on the facts, and I think we'll have the review results this summer. So hopefully that will provide a new opening for all of you to have more engagement both here in the United States and abroad. In closing, let me just say that no one knows how fast the Iranian regime will change, but change will come. It's obvious that Iran is facing a split among its leadership. A long brewing power struggle between President Ahmadinejad and the Supreme Leader Khomeini recently burst into public view over Ahmadinejad's decision to dismiss the intelligence minister. That the battle was over much more than just the intelligence ministry, and there are deeper issues at stake which are far from resolved. And this test of wills between the ruling clerical establishment and Ahmadinejad loyalists demonstrate how dysfunctional this system is. And the power struggle has left the Iranian president weakened and revealed many lessons about the strange political workings of this Islamic Republic. But the real battle in Iran is not within the regime, but between the regime and the brave young people who took to the streets in 2009 to demand a better leadership. No one knows how long it will take, but the forces of liberty are not on the side of this regime. And we all have an obligation to do more to support those who are struggling for freedom, not just in Tunis and Cairo and the streets of Tripoli, but on the streets of Tehran as well. And I commend you for your efforts to bring about that change. Thank you.